Okay, I'm excited to do this week in review. I think there was really great discussion both in the reading annotations and on the discussion board. And I'm going to kind of just go over some of that and maybe help you resolve some of the contradictions that you put forward in your desire for everyone to get along and find some kind of quote unquote balance or something in between or some kind of combination. The picture you see here right off the bat just shows you what AI, when I ran through AI, your discussion board posts, these are the most common viewpoints. So there's really one viewpoint that's kind of isolated from everybody else, and then there's four viewpoints that kind of where you cluster. So that's a total of five viewpoints, and then the sixth one that you see kind of over in the far right hand corner is just for some students that just had a hard time saying what they meant to say. AI doesn't know what to do with your statements when you're not kind of clear. But so there's different camps or different groups, and I'm going to go over what those are. But the concepts you're really focusing on was this concept of agreement. I'd even say agreement versus beliefs. That leads you to this kind of idea of there being diverse or many perspectives. You identified certain factors that are necessary for legal reasoning or what we're calling jurisprudence, and then also factors that actually have an influence on how people make their decisions, people being you, how you make your decisions. AI found a kind of commonality in those factors. And then this idea of what is just law, or what is kind of, that's almost like a pun, what is just law, and then also what is just law. So we're going to kind of go and unpack some of this together. So I think it's useful to use the AI categories that came up here. We've got on the one hand, we've got a rule, and then on the other hand, we've got perspective. So think about the rule as like a rule book or something, everybody could read and they could look at it and see what they think. You really want those to be certain and you want them to be clear. On the other hand, on the other side, you recognize that we all have different or other perspectives. So this should help you understand that everyone's going to interpret those rules in the rule book differently. And so how do we make sense of that? Well, you made sense of it in two ways. On the one hand, you focused on a system that's legal, beautiful, multiple, but some kind of collection or organization of rules. On the other hand, you acknowledge that there's a legal and social reality, and those aren't always the same thing, and that leads into the different and other perspectives. So that comes out when you start talking about law, because we see natural, positive, important, universal. These kind of different terms or concepts or philosophies of law are really competing with each other. So there isn't really a way for you to find a middle ground because, of course, right, again, it's interesting. Several of you have used geographical or even maritime, people who use boats, references or metaphors. But again, of course, law is not a building, it's not a tree, right? It's not a star in space. So we can't really map them this way. So I want to try to map them in the way that one student, E-Ray, pointed out early in the visual structures, is that law is a hierarchy, right? So if you think of this is kind of upside down, right? Then the rules and the perspectives feed into the two systems and reality, and then that is what influences or creates the law. But I want you to understand what a logical contradiction is. It's impossible that the same thing can at the same time both belong and not belong to the same object and in the same respect. And all other specifications that might be made, let them be added to meet logical objections. So for instance, natural law and positive law cannot be in the same place at the same time. So there is no way to split those up and then find a third way or a middle ground. In other words, one judge can't be both a natural law and a positivist at the same time. They're going to have to make a decision on which of those is going to influence their idea of law. Everything that would come after that in their decision then would be something that the other side would object to and not agree with. To pull this even further, then, is contradiction natural? Is it something part of our positive reality? And the answer to both is yes. And so there's kind of three historical or humanities-based quotes here that I want to provide. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. In other words, right, our humanness is not reduced to one thing. You're not one thing. So of course you're going to contradict yourself, and you're going to change your mind, and all of these kind of things that we all know about human beings. On the other side, vorai non vorai, right? It's true and it's not true at the same time. This is so difficult, but if you ever get the chance to watch Don Giovanni, you'll see why this makes sense. I love her and I love her too. I love him and I love him too. I love all four of them, right? Love is usually the one where we see this contradiction so clearly. But then there's also, Lewis Carroll really tried to make this very complicated idea interesting to children. And so he invented this concept or this creature called the bread and butterfly. And I think, not everybody has bread and butter, right? But if you have toast, you go to a diner, or you go to Denny's or whatever, and you have toast, you have some bread, and you have some butter. Everybody's familiar with this, right? So this creature that allegedly kind of goes, hand in hand, Alice wants to know, well, how does it, what does the bread butterfly eat? How does it live? How does it survive? And the answer, at the time, this was popular, right? The queen kind of required everyone to have tea, and it couldn't be too strong. So it has to be weak tea with, 2 lumps of sugar. And Alice, a very smart child, says, well, but what if, there is no tea? What if they're not offered? So what is the answer to that question, right? What is the contradiction here? Is that this creature that evolved over time through bread and butter seems like it's a good match, but then it requires this other thing to keep on going and living. I'm not going to answer the question. I want you to look at it yourself. I'm curious as to know whether you respond the same way Alice does when you find out the answer. And so, what does happen to the bread butterfly if it can't find weak tea and sugar? So I want to show and pull out your contradictions in your class. I think it's really nice from my heart that you all want to get along and give each other positive encouragement on the discussion boards for the most part. And not a but I want you also to think deeply about where you disagree, because you can also be nice in your disagreement. You don't have to just say, hey, good job, and then it doesn't show me whether you actually understood what the person said. I think Stephanie does a really good job of rephrasing what people said, so maybe look at her posts and think about how you might use that as an example. That's just coming to my head right off the bat. So I'm going to pull out a few phrases that you said. I tend to side with positive law because everyone has to follow the same law. Versus, or think about this one, how does this disagree? People tend to break the rules, right? So obviously people don't follow the same law. People tend to break the rules because the rules don't have vigorous enforcement. So it's not really the rules, it's you need a cop to punish you in order for people to follow the rules. Let's take New York City as an example. You could rob someone under $1,000 and come out of jail in a couple of hours. I'd love to see the statistics on this. The person puts it as you could, so it's hypothetically one person could do it, sure. How often does this happen, I think, would be a different story. You'd want to do the stats on it. But the point, I think, is made here. People take advantage of laws. Oftentimes students call them loopholes when they know they're doing something wrong, but they also know there's not a significant consequence. I always wonder kind of like, should we cut people's hands off then if they steal? Right? I mean, so there's, what's the most severe consequence we can get away with versus what's the minimum consequence we can get away with? Something to think about. Brianna said she'd choose the middle. I'm empathetic. Several of you actually wanted to find a balance or the middle. I know why you want to do that, but I just want to let you know it's impossible, right? I mean, of course you can do it. I mean, you can believe in whatever you want, right? Easter Bunny, things like that. But, in an academic environment and in your career, you're going to have to make a choice. You're going to have to decide. You don't have to decide right now. So if you're feeling like you want to be in the middle, that's okay. That just means you haven't, you're a little non-committal. You're having some hard time trying to make a decision. That's fine. You don't have to make the decision right now to get an A in this class. Natural law and positive law represent contrasting, right? So two different theories in jurisprudence regarding the origin, sources, and validity of the law. So it's kind of like, you wanting to find a middle ground between two things that are polar opposites. So is it a middle, or is it what they say in Anglo-Saxon culture is a muddle, right? A mix of things that isn't quite clear. Well, you all know how to write a fence, split hairs, and open up those loopholes. So all the things you're kind of critical about, you're kind of doing in your discussion board posts is something to think about. But if we put all of your kind of concepts into a typical, 8-year-old sentence, here's how we break it down. So these are kind of everything that you put out there, and the larger things being the things that more students used or were said more often. But there's a lot of interesting stuff, right? We've got knowledge in here, we've got belief, we've got people, we've got laws, we've got society, we've got rights, we've got values, we've got ethics, we've got the concept of being universal or it being individual and specific, we've got women, we've got men, we've got bodies, we've got interpretations, we've got independence, we've got flexibility, we've got a lot of fun stuff here, right? So what I love about this as a teacher is that you are all thinking about this very deeply, and that is wonderful and perfect. And what I like about this as a legal scholar is you're showing that there isn't one legal system, right? That there's a lot of competing ideas. So I wanted to make it, kind of fun here. On the one hand, we have positive law. They're saying there is no nature. And on the other hand, we've got natural law where they're saying, legislators, you are wrong. There is a nature. And we want to see, I'm interested in Brianna and some of your point about, let's see if we can find a balance. Let's see what happens when we try to see, is there some place in between these two points? I'm doing this largely because I'm kind of curious if you take like the MAGA and the AOC people, who are far, far, far on the left and far, far, far on the right in politics. We all want to find some middle ground. At least some of us want to find some middle ground. So let's think about it that way, right? I mean, if there's this idea of finding middle ground against two people who don't even really believe the other exists or is a good person, what do we do? Well, so I ran your discussion board post through AI, and this is how it would summarize it. And I'll read it again because I think it's kind of fun. A legal system created and enacted by humans. Very good, computer, you figured that part out. Positive law is flexible and adaptable, changing with societal needs and values. It provides structure, order, and enforceability to the legal system. Positive law is derived from the authority and power of the government, and it governs human behavior within a specific jurisdiction. In terms of which perspective I would side with, this is AI now reading into what it thinks you as a group would do. I believe that a combination of both natural law and positive law is necessary for a balanced legal system. Natural law provides a moral compass and a universal principles that guide our understanding of justice and human rights. It emphasizes the innate dignity and worth of every individual. Positive law, on the other hand, recognizes the realities of societal changes and the need for adaptable laws to address evolving needs. It provides a formal framework for legal systems and ensures enforceability and order. By incorporating aspects of both natural and positive law, we can create a legal system that is grounded in moral principles while also being responsive to the needs of society. I think this is very beautiful said as an ideal. We're going to get into why this has not happened. Furthermore, I appreciate the perspective of legal realism, which emphasizes the practical implementation of laws and the impact of legal decisions in real-world context. It recognizes that law is not just an abstract set of principles, but is shaped by social, economic, and political factors surrounding it. Legal realism reminds us to consider the consequences and effects of laws on individuals and society as a whole. This is what we're kind of going to get into next. Ultimately, and I put this in bold to kind of, this is the problem, right? The choice between natural law and positive law depends on one's philosophical beliefs and ethical values, even for those of you who say law should not be based on morals, and yet you have a lot of strongly held opinions about morals that you want other people to follow, right? So we've got that contradiction again. Both perspectives have their strengths and weaknesses, and a balanced approach that considers moral principles, societal needs, and practical implementation is necessary for a fair and just legal system. I'd add or correct AI, say, assuming the people who are trying to balance and see the strengths and weaknesses understand these ideas. Natural law is based on fundamental moral principles and provides a constant basis for laws, while positive law is changeable and depends on specific cases. The author believes in natural law and argues in favor of a woman's right to choose abortion. Of course, not all of you agree with that, but you didn't mention it in your discussion board, and so AI thinks that you all are in agreement. They also advocate for multiple legal systems. Interesting, right? Because one student wanted there only to be one system that everybody has to follow. We've got multiple options here, and the need for different perspectives in addressing conflicts. They suggest focusing on more pressing issues like racism, criminal justice reform, and gun violence, rather than debating whether victims of sexual assault should have the right to choose abortion. So this also now gets into priorities of legislation. Interesting, right? So this class has these kind of conflicting, contradicting ideas, but then there's also some overlap on this desire to have a more balanced system. So again, we're going to see how this might work. So if we look at natural law, I'm going to put it in like as simplest terms as possible. For many of you, you kind of wanted that. So the basic idea is that lobs is observation in common, right? So, we form the law based on what we see. So if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, the idea was that animals, humans, we want to be free. So if we are not free under a government, if it's becoming too restrictive on us, then what do animals do? They overthrow this kind of thing that's trying to hold them down. What do humans do in history? We overthrow governments when they become too abusive. And so that's the idea of the Declaration of Independence. I declare my independence from the government. I have the right to, and then you of course know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But here's the problem with this, right? That critics have of natural law is like, okay, well, if we say something like that, or we look at nature and we say, okay, all animals procreate, right? All animals have sex. Human beings are animals, so therefore all human beings ought to have sex and procreate, create children. If I said that in a classroom, there'd be laughing, right? But there'd also be disagreement. People would say, no, not everybody should procreate, right? Some people should not procreate. People with certain genetic disabilities or propensities that they're going to pass on their children, right? They might choose they shouldn't procreate. Well, so then they just violated natural law. Some of you think that some criminals shouldn't procreate, right? So we'd have a hard time coming to this idea of what ought to happen and what not ought to happen. So this is always the conflict. But there are general things that we agree are natural rights, says one scholar of natural law, and he puts these ideas out there as knowledge, or the pursuit, the desire to have knowledge, right? We need knowledge just to kind of survive in this environment. Life, we all want to be alive. Again, there's exceptions to this, but we mostly all kind of agree that everyone has the right to live. Everyone, especially children, should have the right to play, right? We think they shouldn't just be sentenced to work at the age of 3 years old, get to work, right? They should have some time of education and play. We believe that we all want to have a feeling that we're alive. Whether it's through the Instagram obsession of quote-unquote experiences, whatever those are, or whether it's a beautiful thing that you see, or whether it's your time in nature, or whether it's time with your family and loved ones. We all want that feeling. Sociability, we all want friends. Everybody wants friends. The friends don't always want them. But especially as people were in COVID isolation, right, there was this kind of uptick or increase in loneliness and mental health problems, right? So we all agree, friendship is a good thing most of the time. Practical reasonableness, basic collaboration, right? When you go to the fast food restaurant, you want them to make your food, they expect you to give the money, right? There are these kind of customs and norms that we have that are practical. They're based on just kind of getting through the day. Religion or spirituality, this includes atheism, paganism, and the belief in all of the gods and angels and demons, and I want them all. This basic idea that we all want to know, why are we here? Is there something more to this? Are they among us? The truth is out there. All these kind of ideas, right? So we don't want to just throw away natural law because there are these basic things that people agree on. But again, the problems is, we say, well, okay, it's everyone has freedom. Okay, so there's this dude here in New York just walking in the middle of the road, right? While there's two people behind him, if you see in the background, they're walking on the sidewalk. So, as somebody who came from Seattle, where they love to give tickets for jaywalking when I was growing up, everyone jaywalks in New York, it seems like. And so, students are always saying, well, if there aren't natural law rules, right, there's chaos. Well, is this chaos? I don't know, maybe. But people are doing it all the time, and drivers and everybody seem to kind of react. This is that practical reasonableness that people have. On the other hand, if you think about like protest, right? We just said we're all independent. We have the right to protest against our government. We have the right to overthrow our government if it becomes abusive. But then, right here we have police saying, no, you don't. You don't have that right. And so, if we say there's a natural law to human dignity, is this dignified? Are the police dignified? Is this individual who's being arrested dignified? I think most people say no, right? So there's a problem with the idea of natural law that it just doesn't seem to work a lot of the time in regular everyday life. We don't seem to be as good as we would like to be. So then we go over to positive law and we say, well, so that's why we need commands, right? That's why we need enforcement. So you probably learned this at some point in a textbook that said, law equals socially agreed upon norms. Now, hopefully they gave you some other ideas, but that's what this class is for. We go a little bit deeper. And some of you also talk about rules, again, that everybody has to follow. But the problem is there's two levels of rules, right? So if I give you the command, grab me that over there. My cousin or my niece or my parents or people who know me really well will probably know what I'm talking about, right? Because you need the context. You have to know what that is. The second thing is you should also know why you should comply. Again, my family and friends, they're going to comply because they trust me or there's some hierarchy here. But if I don't know you and you say, do this thing, first of all, if you don't know what the thing is, then you're in big trouble, right? You violate the rules. And then secondly, if you don't know why you're supposed to do that thing, then again, you're in big trouble. I think immigration law is a great example of this. The media, which has got to be just the dumbest I've ever heard in this debate, and unfortunately a lot of you start to repeat these things. You make it sound as if there's a line that people get into or a queue, just like, if you're standing at McDonald's to get a hamburger. Somebody please tell me, where is this line? And second of all, where would it be if there was one? There isn't one, but where would it be? Most immigrants come in through the airport. I think it'd be a great idea to have processing in the airports, but we'd have to redesign. New architects would have to come in. We'd have to change fundamentally how airports function. It would also slow down travel, so people would complain, right? You see all these problems. There are some places along the Canadian and Mexico border where someone could theoretically get in line, but of course this is for big trucks that are bringing in your TVs and the food and the clothes that you all love from other countries. Those checkpoints aren't made for human beings to cross in immigration. So people are very confused and very wrong about how immigration law works in the United States. So not only do they not understand the command, they also don't understand the context. So imagine if you didn't speak the language, or if you didn't understand, for example, let me give you one example. Anybody can get in the country in the United States if you have $500,000 and promise to employ more than 5 people. You probably didn't know that there's a whole visa category just for models, right? People who show their bodies for money. There are problems that we call moral turpitude, where, let's say you're fleeing religious or political persecution in your country, but you were charged with a crime, right? You think it's unjust, or you think they were doing it just because you're a different political party. Well, we can say you don't get to come in because that was a crime of moral turpitude. There's lots of, there's bias against who gets to come into the United States. We are far less scrutiny to people from Eastern Europe than we are from people from the Caribbean. There's racism built into the system. There's religious bias into the system, right? So there's all these problems that show you that there isn't one law, there isn't a socially agreed upon norms, and especially with immigration. I mean, people have all sorts of wild opinions, and they're all very different from each other, and they usually have almost nothing to do with the actual immigration laws. The general idea of positive law or law as command really is like father knows best, right? It's that old idea where you challenge your father or the parental figure, and they don't have a rational explanation. They can't give you an example from nature. They just say, because I said so. And this is fine. There are people who might prefer this kind of environment. The problem is, of course, not everybody does. And so 2 examples are pretty common, one historical and one present day. The most commonly example pointed to are the Nuremberg trials, or the Nazi persecution of Jews and others, and specifically the Jews in the Holocaust. Eichmann, who was the chief architect of the quote-unquote final solution, had two defenses, legal defenses, both valid under German law. One is, of course, there was no actus reus, that there was no law in Germany that said that he could not round up and execute Jews. The second one is that he was following orders, right? So it's not me you should be mad at, it's my boss, right? If anybody broke a law, it must be the boss. So think about that for a second, right? If you're saying that there's only one rule, or there's laws and those are passed by father or the group, what if those laws are unjust towards another group, right? You're saying, no, we should just follow those anyways. And you're also kind of suggesting that like Jews should have like volunteered for the Holocaust because they'd be following the law. That obviously is a logical contradiction that also is, right, offensive. The second one, though, is that the argument you keep hearing in court from police officers when you think that they abused their power, but they say, no, I was just doing my job, I couldn't have violated your civil rights. And so, again, like if there's one rule and the rule is whatever the people in charge say it is, then you can't question what they did, right? They're always right then under those circumstances. So we obviously don't believe that as a people and as human beings. And so this then sends us back to natural law, where we say, well, there must be some things that we think are important: human dignity, life, etc. And I think you should go look at Brianna's arguments about, the male domination in legislation regarding abortion and also war, right? She asks, what would law be if women were in charge, right? It's an interesting kind of question. You might think about, from your practical experience, what's the difference between a classroom taught by a woman and a classroom taught by a man, and what are the pressures and things like that. Same thing with a corporation. What's the difference, right? There are obviously differences. The other kind of thing to think about then is your resistance and rebellion right or correct or lawful when you are responding to an unjust law? This is a question that Aquinas argued, and also Martin Luther King Jr., who, again, remember, would have been labeled criminal under positive law, but many of you hold out for him to be a founder of civil rights and natural law. So you see that conflict there. Again, I don't see where the middle ground would be between the Holocaust and the right to human dignity. There isn't a middle ground there. So it's hard to argue that you could find some kind of balance for that. So then students kind of sought out, which I love, right? There's a third perspective, legal realism, that then kind of says, well, let's not make it an argument, and let's just go out and see, how do people really live? So like jazz, law is made up as we go. There isn't one universal law that everybody follows. There isn't, a thing that we all understand. We're basically confused, and we're trying to make sense of it in our courts, in Congress, right, in our local laws, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, right? We're all in our families, at the kitchen table. We're all trying to do this, and it's a messy process. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's not clear. And so we want to look at the effects and consequences of legislation and judicial decisions, and we want to focus in on what is actually happening. I put a question mark because, of course, it's linked, well, what is actually happening? Who's to say that what you say is actually happening is the correct thing that's actually happening? And so if there's 5 or 6 different versions of the truth, as we see in politics today, then how are we supposed to make any sense of this? So legal realism kind of sounds okay at first, and then it doesn't really tell us much. And so even if we wanted to try to see what is actually happening, how do we do this? So for example, I hear every semester, and by the way, also in the news, that crime is going up. Yet when I look at the FBI, Department of Justice, if I look at criminal justice professors and academic researchers, as you can see from here, crime is most certainly going down. There is no question that crime is going down. And you are talking about violent crime, and so that's what I pulled here. So when we say, let's find out what's really happening. Well, what's really happening, when I talk to people outside my apartment, they think the world is going to hell. They think it's the worst it's ever been. They think the crime is going up. When I actually look at the statistics and the cases, it's the opposite of what they're talking about. And so how do we measure something when people are so wrong about so many basic things? And before you start thinking, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and okay, fine. What do you see here in this picture? Do you see a duck or a bunny? Which one is right? I want you to think about that. Perception is a very difficult thing, put it that way. So then I wanted to show critical legal studies because a couple of you kind of made reference to this. So law is made by and for rich white men. And the points here are all facts, right? Courts don't solve most problems. Over 90% of cases don't go to trial. They're solved in other ways, the plea bargain, alternative dispute resolutions, and those are just the ones that make it that far. Most of the things, as you identified in the first discussion board, get settled way before that process. They get settled at the workplace. They get settled in the grocery store. They get settled in your family. And so courts aren't really this thing we hold them out to be. They create a lot of problems. So one student referred to, right, the person robs somebody under $1,000, they find a loophole, the language you use, but they find a statute, a rule, a positive law that says that they don't have to go to jail because they're going to serve X number of days in a rehab institution, and are let out that day. So that creates a larger problem, right? Bond creates a larger problem. Bail creates a larger problem. Early release programs, work release programs, right? Courts create a number of problems that didn't exist without them. The other issue is there isn't really one way of legal reasoning. There's some people believe you should look at the original intent of the founders, whatever they think that means, because if you start doing your research, you'll find the founders all thought very different things. So there's the Federalist Papers, then there's the Anti-Federalist Papers. There's the people who were pro-slavery, and there's the people who were against slavery. There's people who thought we should still have connections with England, and there's others that said, no, we should do our own thing. There's some people who said we should just get rid of all the American Indians, and other people said, no, we should learn to live with them, right? So there isn't one original intent, but people try to say, well, let's see if we can find one. Then there's textualism. People say, well, let's just look at the law and let's just do what it says. If any of you think you can do this, I challenge you to look at the IRS tax code and explain it to your parents. There are other issues like, okay, fine. So homicide is defined as the unlawful killing of another with malice aforethought. So what is malice? How do you define malice? If somebody is a stone cold killer and they kill somebody and they have no emotions, is that malice? If they're super emotional and they're hysterical about it, is that malice? Textualism is, sounds good, and then except for when you get people in a room and nobody can agree on what the text says. Historical analysis, should we look and see, how long has something been going on? That was the argument in Dobbs. So it said, women don't have a right to abortion because over the last 100 years, 150 years, the states have said they don't. Right, so I know Brianna doesn't like that argument, but that was the reasoning that the court used in this most recent abortion case. So they use history. Should they use analytical theories like Dworkin and other scholars who say we should try to, think about how the law in an analytical way? So like the same way that a math or a scientist uses their reasoning. Should we pay more attention to emotions, how people feel? Should we look at victim statements? Should we think about a living document, a thing that changes over time and we use to create new rights? That was the argument in opposition to the Dobbs case. They're saying abortion should be a right because we're changing, society is changing, and women should have this right. There's also this thing that law students learn called IRAC, issue, rule, application, conclusion, right? Should that be the way that all judges make decisions based on precedent and really just following the same thing that law students do? Although most of them don't do a very good job of it in my experience. Or should they do this thing called abductive reasoning, where everyone should go back and examine their assumptions and then explain how did they come to that rule in the first place? So I kind of close with these three ideas. Is we don't really know much about human relations everywhere. We don't know how people operate, in the jungles of Amazon. We don't know how the prison system works in Siberia. We don't know how people who are breaking ice up in Antarctica are making rules with each other, right? It's not that we can't know these things. It's just we don't really, we don't have enough scientists. We don't have enough social scientists. We don't have enough criminal justice students to go out and collect all this data and then analyze it. Laws contradict each other all the time because, of course, we contradict ourselves all the time. And so the most obvious example, I just saw a news report yesterday, is the states that have legalized marijuana are arguing to the federal government that you really got to stop making marijuana possession a federal crime, right? We've got this conflict, it's contradiction. That's just one example. There's thousands of examples where what we call the conflict of laws, if you want to find a book on that. And then finally, the law is not the biggest concern for most people. I know people who the Bible is the biggest concern. I know other people who getting ahead and taking advantage of people and making money is their biggest concern. I know people who they just want to have sex with people. Other people, they just want to travel all over the world and go into debt. So law is not really the thing that most people think about most of the time. And then critical legal studies, I think, has shown, I think pretty clearly that, for example, look at this graphic. The off-white color are the number of white people that are the people who make the laws. Right, this is, if you're saying that the law is made mostly by white people, statistically that is true. This is the what it says, there are more racially and ethnically diverse people. This is not much, right? But there are more than there used to be. So laws that are older than 5 or 6 years would be less representative than ones that were made 10 years in the future. Something to think about. We also see that the treatment of black people in this country is atrocious, right? And so the laws affect one group of people, black and Latino males in particular, more than they do white people. In fact, most white people don't actually experience the law in their personal life. And then another thing is to think about is like New York, right? If you look at this immigration-based map, we have a lot of different people from immigration categories, but there are some categories that are better represented than others. And so if you look around the country and the individual states, you'll see that immigrants aren't coming from the same place. So they're bringing different traditions, different viewpoints, different ideas. And so, right, it's not going to reflect their values and their points of view. So there is no one law to rule them all, right? That's the main learning outcome here. So for those of you who want there to be, you'd have to figure out how to solve all those problems that came before. The other big issue is that most cases don't go to trial. And so the cases now that the judges are deciding, that makes them more and more important because there's fewer and fewer cases. So a judge makes a decision. Now that has a huge impact on the system because it's not as many, right? So there's not as much disagreement or different opinions coming through. The other thing is that a lot of you think there's a lot because we pay attention to like Donald Trump and Johnny Depp and these people who really I wish we just did not care about. But we have this cult of celebrity in this country, and so and the true crime shows, and so we think that this is happening all the time. But again, it's not, right? So there's the difference between what we see on TV and social media and what actually happens in a courthouse. Everybody should go visit the downtown Manhattan courthouse and just see what happens. You might be. I mean, I'm thrilled when I go there. So those of us who are nerds, we love it. But you might be really bored. You might say, "Wow, this is nothing like TV," because it isn't. And so, just things there's a huge difference. There's a huge gap between what everyday people think and what actually happens. The other issues to think about is like if you look at the crimes committed in each state. So if you look at the total country, the most prevalent crime, like the crime that's committed most, is petty theft, right? People stealing, usually from their workplace. That's the most common place. But the saying, Brooklyn saying, it fell off the back of a truck, right? So in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was stealing from the internet, right? Stealing songs and movies. So pretty low-level stealing is the most common crime across the country. And you'll see it's just there's a slightly more of it in New York, which again, things fall off trucks all the time in New York. On the other hand, like murder is like tiny, right? It's not very, most crimes are not murder, right? But what do we see on TV? What do we see on the dramas? What do we see on social media? We tend to focus on the murders, right? I wanted to pull another example where you could see where, there is violent crime in one state called Nevada, and I think you could, it's Las Vegas. What do you expect? But you'll see that there's far less theft there. Isn't that kind of funny? Well, no, right? Because the police really prioritize that. They're trying to stop theft because otherwise people won't bring their money to gamble and lose it the old-fashioned way. They'll get it stolen by somebody else. But there's also, because of that system of gambling, there's also prostitution, there's assault, right? There's fighting, there's drinking. There's all these other things that kind of happen. So, just something to think about is like what crimes are actually committed is very different than what people think there are. So I do want to go back to this idea and end with this, that Brianna got us to start thinking about legal pluralism, which I have taught in previous classes. And I've got some additional videos on YouTube if you want to go into it deeper. But I want to put it in the kind of language that you're using from kind of these principles we've been talking about. Is like, first of all, we're all in this together. So there is no middle. There is no balance. It's more like what happens in physics is where things are bumping up against each other and they all coexist at the same time. But no one's there to organize or be like, okay, we've got too much positive law, so we need to put a little bit more natural law, right? It's more chaos. It's more the same way that everything works in nature. anyways, law is the dominant daddy. That's one point of view, right? That you want one person to be in charge and tell you what to do. So there's some people who that's how they see law. Other people say, no, I see law as a tool I use to get what I want. And so that's how they use law. Other people say, no, law is the bad guy. I have to defend myself against it, and so they see it that way. So there's no balance. It is anarchy. I just think that you've taken that term and given it a new meaning, besides what it really means, right? Which is these things bumping up against each other and coexisting, and that's just called reality, or physics. So then what is our court system trying to do? I think it's right to think about it as trying to find a balance. I think it's trying to. I just go back to the Foucault reading, where he's asking you, are you sure that's possible? Are you sure that's middle class? Are you sure that's popular justice? Is that the kind of justice that you students want? Or are you looking for something that's different than arranging the court, according to chairs, a bench, and a table, and putting forward one set of arguments and then another set of arguments, and then the judge trying to decide, now that you know that there's all these different theories and philosophies. So, these are things you have to think about, and just to understand that they all exist together. So you can't just have one, right? These are all things that coexist. And I want you to think about then, moving forward then, is how can people get justice? I think one student, I want to say, said something along these lines, is that, how can people expect justice in this kind of multiple reality, right? And I think it's a very good question that they're trying to get us to think about. I think it was Brianna Farrell, actually. But so you might look at her post. So I will check in with you next week as you try to think about now comparing this system to an older system, and still exists in much of the world, including our own here in the United States, of the test. So what that might look like.